Greetings, everyone! It is I, Tentus Dracovin, your Lord and Emperor here at the Dracovin Empire, and welcome! I hope you're joining me either live on Twitch, or if you're watching this later on YouTube, hey, welcome one and all. Regardless of where you're from, we're going to be talking more about Golarion today. Why, yes, we're diving once more into the Pathfinder world, and we're continuing with yet another ancestry you can play. Now, granted, I will tell you, I will have a separate episode talking about half-orcs in the future. And half-orcs are a difficult subject when it comes to the nature of Golarion because, technically speaking, there is a lot of bad history there. Granted, there are plenty of times where half-orcs are born from, well, decent relationships. It's just that with a lot of the history, as we'll talk about with orcs, and particularly when we talked about the hold of Belkazin earlier in a previous episode, and this one here, there's a lot of things about their history that involve, honestly, violence and a lot of terrible things. And in general, orcs as they are now, yeah, they're kind of better-ish. There is still a warrior, rule-by-strength culture, certainly, to them, and we'll talk about this. But depending on where you are from, depends on a lot how you're raised and how you exist and stuff too. And the culture itself isn't always the same. And granted, places like the hold on to the deepness of the warlike nature of orcs' original culture. But the hold is one place, and orcs have been scattered. And we'll talk about a little bit of this and in this way. So why don't we start breaking down the orcs, because they are a major part of Golarion history, and they are a ancestry you can play. And again, if you were playing an orc, especially if you're playing in a generally, in quotations, good-aligned game, you will have a lot of the stigma of what your ancestors honestly did, and a lot of that cultural influence that you might be fighting against if you are looking to be more of a civilized or an adventurer type, because that's kind of probably what a lot of it is you left on an adventure for various reasons. But we can talk about that. Anyway, let us begin with, of course, throwing up an image here of an orc. So, raiding, violence, a kind of general hatred of civilization, and being very warlike are what is the notorious nature of orcs. And certainly this has been proven by a lot of their old culture. We'll get into that, though. So, orcs tend to be kind of almost a little feral looking. They're humanoid, but with kind of more bestial features. Oversized, kind of boar-like canines, sharp teeth, around 6 feet in height. Some are much larger. They're very muscular, or tend to be. They scar easily, so even the younger warriors amongst their groups and tribes will have a lot of scars. Their skin tone varies from like a sallow pink through grays, dark greens. They have small, beady eyes that are very sensitive to sunlight, and their facial features are vaguely pig-like, and their hair is wiry like a boar's bristle, and on average they're around 210 pounds. So, let's talk about the elephant in the war room, because it is a big elephant and adds the orc adventurers. The thing is, orcs are driven to overcome challenge, and they prove themselves. And this can be done amongst your tribes, but there are those that set out to become adventurers because traveling the world and going to places and finding challenges beyond your tribe, because you might not have the opportunity to prove yourself in amongst some of your peers or to overcome certain challenges because of the society you're built upon and those around you. There are different types of challenges. Most likely, sometimes these orcs are more likely to set out on their own. Anyway. Or maybe with a smaller group of orcs. But there are the rare orcs that find themselves in the company of other ancestries and are willing to do that. And because of the nature and their society, martial classes like barbarians and fighters are the most favored out of all of them. So they're soldiers through and through because of that. A little bit of that battle history. So let's talk about the history. And I use this for the whole of this image. It's a good one. So, orcs were originally in the Darklands. And once the dwarves encounter them, they were basically effectively animalistic. A lot of that savagery that exists within them was in this area. You have to think about the original orcs that existed in the Darklands as effectively being on the cusp of becoming I'm not saying sentient. They were sentient, but they hadn't developed any, more than just basic tribal, violent culture at that point in time. They are effectively the early days of having some levels of sentience, probably rudimentary kind of ideas of some kind of tooth or tool use, and so they are very primitive people. The fights against the dwarfs, who were civilized, basically taught the very rudimentary parts of civilization to the orcs. The battles with the dwarfs brought them a level of civilization. This is a foe that they can't overcome with just fist, teeth, and fury, which was the way that they fought up until now, So they learned about weapons by those that they stole from the dwarfs. They learned about armor from them and modified the armors that were stolen from defeated dwarfs to hit their frames. And the thing is that, this is not enough for them because, this was rising from being just an animal to a civilization. And it was not spurred on by their own need to develop. It was spurred on by conflict with the dwarfs, which is another reason that we see that orcs are a little bit more savage, because they didn't have an opportunity on their own to develop to this level where they're beginning civilization. It was thrust upon them by getting into a conflict. The quest for the sky that the dwarves enacted did force them to retreat, and they were forced onto the surface of Golarion. And they were ahead of the dwarfs, places like Deepgate and other places in the surface. So they reached the surface around a negative 5102 AR, and this was the Age of Darkness. So orcs are arriving after Earthfall. The Age of Darkness was the period, which I've talked a little bit about, that was basically a 1,000-year period where, after Earthfall, there was a lot of ash in the atmosphere, there wasn't as much sunlight, things were a lot difficult. It wasn't quite blocking out the sun, but it was blotting out the sun. So it was kind of like a very difficult time period. It was an apocalyptic time period for a lot of things. It was the atmosphere, all the stuff knocked in the atmosphere from Earthfall, causing a lot of issues. This is when a lot of those civilizations destroyed, and of course, both the orcs and some others, popped out during this time period. And showing up on the surface during this time, what's left? Thassalon and Aslan are shattered, they're destroyed, and so the orcs prospered during this time period. In their history, it's known as the Sacking, where they basically rampaged across the surface world unopposed, while the dwarfs gave them a challenge. There was no other humanoid species in a position to do that. Thanks, motorcycles. What was left after the big destruction? I really should close that window for these. That's going to be remembering to do that next time, because it'll still cut some of the noise down. Anyway, it was perpetual time period where their savage nature, their raiding. Again, what have we been taught? Fight other things, overcome them, defeat them, crush them, devour them, and of course, take from them. That's what they learned from the dwarfs, is what do they have that can make us stronger and stuff like that. What weapons do you have? And the problem then is the Age of Darkness ended and led into the Age of Anguish, where sunlight became a major thing. And while dwarfs, though creatures of the underground and dark, they still created light sources. They used lights because it was useful still too. Orcs never did. So the sun was, blinding to them. And this was the decline of orcs' power on the surface. This was marked, of course, when Belkazin, who created the Hold, basically gathered together the remaining tribes, kind of built them together, wanted to drive back the dwarfs who had come to the surface by then. The sacking of Jenigov happened in negative 3709. The conquering of the Sky Citadel, Koladar, and the rise of the Hold of Belkazin happened during this time period. And since then, there have been really no major historical moments for orcs, unfortunately. I did forget to... I honestly did forget something here that I wanted to show off, and I'll do that in a second here as we continue. Anyway, yeah. Anyway, I did forget to show off two things here. The books. We're going to introduce it here, the two books that I recommend checking out. Orcs of Golarion, and of course, the Monster Codex add a lot to these. Whoopsie me. Forgot to mention those first. Oops. I've got to pick them together to show them off. They're in the middle now. But those are two books I recommend to look at if you're looking deeper into them for a little bit more information. But these are the basics that we can give right now. And again, it's not that there isn't more history. I would see the Hold of Belkazin as its history when I talked about that for a lot of more recent orc history. And beyond that, orcs are scattered people. Those that aren't the Hold are scattered to small places where they can survive. The tribes of Belkazin are the main groups of orcs, to say the least. So generally, as I talked about, they're about 6 feet high, very muscular. One of the things about them is emotions. Orcs encounter emotions much more intense than many other humanoids. The ones that you see are things like rage, jealousy, lust, negative emotions. Those are the ones that are mostly displayed because they are in a very violent culture. Remember, the strong shall lead, power of the fittest. But the thing is, it works in other ways, as they are just emotional in general. It's just those negatives seem to stand out more than anything. They have a high pain threshold. It's thought that might not be physiological. It might be basically they encounter a lot of pain throughout their life. And that they just encounter it just as much as any other sentient race, but they have, stoicism towards it, have had it a lot. So there is a culture in orc society to embrace pain, surviving agony that would break or kill another creature. There are those that claim that orc eyes didn't adapt to the burning light of the sun. They learned to endure it. Kind of metal there, but they develop very fast in life and are short-lived. So if you don't die violently, very rarely can an orc make it to 60. Yes, so if you get to be 60, you're an ancient orc. And chances of you existing that way, very low. So they have shorter lifespans, and the high attrition of a lot of violent societies, but they do, very similar to things like goblins that I've talked about in the past, reproduce at a pretty high rate. A orc mother is kept from the battlefield and typically gives birth between 2 to 5 young at a time. A occasional single birth who was said to devour their siblings in utero, very shark-like, is said to be an omen of greatness. So Yes. The thing is, if you decimate a tribe in about a decade, they can rebuild their numbers. That's how much they can produce children and go have more of them. And childhood for an orc is kind of brutal. Weak or cold, and you are physically mature at age 12. But most males, at very least, are trained as warriors as early as 8. Which gets us into their society, because we do have to talk a little bit about orc society as a whole. And that wonderful thing of the beheaded dude. It's orc society. So, again, strength and combat are the two top things that are important. And the right of an orc, of any orc that's part of one of their societies, is to take what they are strong enough to take and control only those that are weak enough to that are too weak to resist them. It's a brutal hierarchy that functions because of traditions that are ingrained in it. And these traditions basically keep things going. First is family loyalty. The idea that help all members of the clan survive. The second is respect for hierarchy. Basically, this thing is the weaker members can survive, and while the stronger ones will perhaps abuse the weaker ones, stronger orcs, because of the respect for hierarchy, rarely kill those below them unless it's a direct challenge. So you will basically see, yeah, you might treat those under you terribly as a orc warlord, but you're not going to kill them because they are of your clan and they are not challenging your authority. You know, the dominance challenge is a pretty big part of the society, though, and basically you have to be ready for it. So, as a leader in the orc society, you face the constant dangers of challengers below you coming after you, and reminders that you might be weaker than those above you. The consequences of a lost battle is normally death, and challengers will buy themselves waiting for moments of weaknesses. This structure is kind of so fundamental to the way they've worked now for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. An idea of equality is kind of madness to them. And the idea of living outside of society for your average orc that isn't this type of one, they don't know what to do because they wish to either serve or be the one that is served from those below you and can abuse them as best you wish. It's a vicious cycle that's been built into their society very heavily all this time, and unfortunately, certainly being banished to the hold and held in place hasn't helped them develop any. It's a region of the world that's not very ripe for survival, and therefore you don't develop a better culture. And unfortunately, that's what's happened to a lot of orcs, is when you have them, they're banished to these places at the fringes. So, a big part of their culture, of course, is beast riding. Now, they're not great riders in and of themselves, but they find many powerful mounts that they will use. Basically, the idea is, I don't have to be a great rider, I just have to have powerful things. Common ones are dire wolves, dire boars, Gorthex, elephants, rhinoceroses, owlbears, highly rare or exotic creatures as your mount will be looked on very well. Mammoths and megafauna in the realm of the mammoth lords are very prized. And again, if you ride a mammoth, it gives you an opportunity to fight the Kelid mammoth riders. In Numeria, the Orcs tribes favor strange beasts from beyond the stars. The Silver Mount, from the crashing starships and stuff. That was a thing that happened. That's a thing to talk about in Numeria. And there are some orcs that have learned how to ride kind of robotic creatures that inhabit Numeria from the crashed starship. So, yes. They're resourceful in a way. Magic. Let's talk about magic, because it is a part of their society too. They're interested in magic when it has immediate and tangible benefits. So, most orcs are unsuitable for spellcasting that requires education or discipline. So, things like sorcerers, oracles, shamans, and witches are great members of their society because they don't have to get a lot of education. They can just go blasting. But another big thing they state, orcs respect, surprisingly, bards and skalds. Mainly because they manipulate emotions and they can whip their orc fellows into a frenzy. So it's this idea that they can be like, they can help rile them up, bring about the greater frenzy within them, means that, yeah, if you're an orc bard, you get a lot of respect. So, if you're a magic user, your abilities can make you an integral part of the tribe. You can rise to the hierarchy, or you can find yourself in a self-imposed exile. That these strange powers are basically above what other orcs would be. So that's kind of where you find your position. Is some magic users use the magic to rise in the hierarchy of tribe because, you know, you don't have physical strength, you have this magical strength. And there are those that discover this magic and understand it in some kind of different region, so will exile yourself because this is beyond the power structure of the tribe. Orcs respect the power of deities, and so spellcasters will often try to associate with them. And that's why arcane casters, like witches or sorcerers, will oftentimes pretend that their power extends from the divine instead, because again, that's an idea of power, you know, respecting divine power. Let's talk a little bit about mythology and their religions. And we'll put out this good lady here who's mostly covered. Anyway, we'll have her, let's do a smaller image of her. No, that's a bigger image of her. It's fine. Anyway, we'll have her for a minute there. Some mythology that I can mention from orcs that would be important to show their kind of way is there's the legend of the Happy Fellow. It's told by orc mothers to their young, and it's about an elf who comes to eat orc children who smiled too much in their sleep. Yeah, things about elves eating them. It's an interesting thing. Anyway. So, orc religion. So, the view of orc religion tends to be an exchange with the power of the god that helps them in battle, and so they don't really have an interest in peaceful deities. There's a lot of them that they do worship. Rovagug, the rough beast. I mean, it's a power, infinite fury. Among greater gods, Lamashtu and Gorum are often worshipped. There are many demons that are worshipped. From demon lords, there's Baphomet, Orcus, Nurgle, Zura. There are some small tribes that have lesser demon lords, such as Terazar, Daklusar, Marmuth, Ovonovu, and the murderous Night Tripper. But this lady here is actually one of the racial demigods that actually was worshipped. The unfortunate thing is, there's a lot of myths and roles to these characters, and they still are worshipped, just not as much anymore. They were paragons of the orc race, and are thought to maybe reach divinity out of sheer orcness or something like that. They have been deities since before the Age of Darkness. They're ancient. And there are a lot more of them, but there are about 8 that are still relatively commonly worshipped. There's this lady here, Drethra, the Dark Mother. There's Lashia, the Slave Lord. Nulgreth, the Blood God. Roll, the Thunderer. Selazorian, the Fire God, Varg, the Iron Warrior, Varix, the Spoiler, and Zargresh, the Destroyer. Drefra here is the orc goddess of birth, fertility, and death. So, she looks over orcs throughout their lives, basically. She blesses those that fight to protect family, land, and possession from enemies. So, yes. Anyway, that is basically the orcs in general. And again, we can dive into their deities and stuff like that and some stuff more. And you can look into more of them on your own. But certainly, orcs are an interesting one to unpack. Because as a people, they still are very much so antagonistic overall. If you were to encounter an orc tribe, they're going to be an enemy in whatever adventure you are because of the nature of their tribe. And that's not to say there are exceptions. There are those that are maybe would have a chance to be less against you. Certainly there are those within the hold that are more negotiable. We've seen that with the evolution within the hold. And so that can happen to other tribes. But there are plenty of tribes which are fairly awful and dark and live to not only some of their most debasest violent ways, but even go farther than that. You can see that, it's this thing that orcs are almost to be pitied, in a way. Why? Again, it comes back to their history. They were slightly evolved animals with slightly larger brains that were maybe a couple steps away from the savage beasts they came from to becoming a society. And were still they weren't even reached the caveman tribal levels. They hadn't even reached that part of it. And the battles against the dwarfs and the dwarven expansion and power within the Darklands basically thrust civilization upon them. Because they found an enemy that they had to become civilized to fight. They needed weapons, they needed army, they needed arms. They needed more to fight them. They needed more strength to fight them, and they adapted. Because they were adaptable to combat, to fighting, to battle, to savaging their enemies. It means that the dwarves are at fault for what the orcs are. And the entire ceaseless war which drove them to the surface in the dwarves' quest for the sky, basically threw these beings out onto the surface world, not only in the best time for them to be there, in the age of darkness, where it was clouded and there was ash in the sky, but threw them out there before they arrived, and of course, with enough time to just live up to those debase attitudes that they had built up in their battles with the dwarfs. They were basically slightly smart animals that were... Think about this. Granted, it's not going to say, but basically think about this. Orcs are almost comparable to something like media with something like Planet of the Apes. Where that was more messing with it with science. But it's the same kind of idea of, encountering and forceful encounters with them forced, basically, development and advancement for these people to a point in time of some level of civilization, of more intelligence and stuff like that. They had that intelligence caked into them, but they didn't understand this kind of stuff. They might not have had language until they encountered the dwarfs. That's the kind of thing that we can think about. They might not have had the same cultures and stuff, and their exposure brought them culture, but it was a need to fight them that brought this culture. A way of violence, a way of animalism. So this animalism still remains within orcs. And can you get rid of that from it, as they are still have that level of beast deep within them? there are those that do evolve beyond that and can go beyond that and can learn beyond that. It is the possibility that exists there within orcs. But 10,000 years or so, that we can say, over 10,000 years that they've been thrust upon this, isn't still a lot of time to develop into a real civilization. It's not like the time periods that orcs or humans or a lot of the intelligent species had to develop. They were thrust into civilization, and violence and animalistic tendencies are what remains. So, will the orcs improve? Will they get to be more of a civilized group? I don't know. There are people that has been thrust upon this and have civilized to a degree, but it might take thousands of years for that to get anywhere closer to it. But for now, we'll end it here, just as a mark of an interesting group. Orcs. Anyway, I thank you for joining me. If you're joining me live on Twitch, hey, thank you for joining. Give at least a follow to give some support. If you are joining me on YouTube, hey, a subscription on YouTube would be great. Ring the bell if you are subscribed to get more alerts, a like, a comment. What do you think about this entire thing? What was your take on orcs as a culture, and have you played one before? Because I'm interested, because I think Pathfinder does a good reason to explain through context why the orcs are the way they are in very few sentences. And it makes sense. And again, I kind of feel pity for them, that this is like a world thrust upon them. They've been uplifted in a way, but not through peaceful means, but through violence. I also have a Discord where you can check out things I have to say, and a Twitter.com, website formerly known as Twitter, where you can check out. I usually threw my schedules up in there and various thought patterns, things like that, brain farts and stuff. And anyway, I'm going to get going for today. I thank you all for being out there and enjoying our trip into orcs. With this in the hold of Belkazin, we've kind of hit on two of the main marks, and we will talk about half-orcs in the future, because they are a marker of both orc society and not, and unfortunately, because of the existence and the nature of orc society, they are a difficult topic to talk about. They are birthed from a violent society. Sometimes nicely, a lot of times, at least in the past, not so. But anyway, until that next time, I bid all of you out there a wonderful farewell, and I hope you join me next time. Farewell.